Hello, VC members and anyone else on the internet that's stumbling across this. Matt here, doing a response video. Actually, going to do two. I'm do this one and another one I'm going to film right after this. So, these come from a guy named Jeff's channel. His channel name is Calico Silver, and that name is in the title of this video. So you can go over to his channel, take a look around, check things out, and subscribe if you like what you see. Really like his channel and would highly recommend it. Jeff's got a good laid-back delivery, a lot of knowledge, quite a few videos over there. He's does reviews, he does just talks about music, does question videos and so forth. He's reviewed or is in the process of reviewing the Beatles albums, the Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, Lou Reed, several others. He talks about quite a bit of music, seems to know his stuff, and highly enjoyable content on his channel there. So Jeff had asked 15 questions for Beatles fans in one video, and in another one he asked 10 questions for Rolling Stones fans. Like I said, I'm going to respond to both of them. I'm going to start with the Beatles, so we'll get right into it. His first question, here I've got my list for both of them. First question, red or blue, meaning the red or blue are the greatest hits albums that came out in 1973. So, takes me back, serendipity. It seems like any time I've ever gotten into something, whether that be the Beatles or some other music group or anything, there's always something really neat that happens right after I get into whatever it is. So, born in 63, I knew of the Beatles, of course. I do remember Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields when they were new. I have distinct memories of a couple of girls that were about 5 or 6 years older than me. They used to babysit me every once in a while that lived down the street. Their grandmother's house was directly across from mine. They used to go over there, hang out all the time, and I remember them sitting on the curb with a transistor radio, singing along to Hey Jude when that was a brand new song. And even though I knew about the Beatles, I didn't go bongo Beatle crazy until I was about 8 or 9, about 9 in 1973. So it would have been 10 later that year, but this is earlier in the year, so it's still 9. And go through that whole story again. I've told it before, but like I said, serendipity, that right after I got into the Beatles, big heavy time, I was looking through the newspaper and I saw in the TV listings that there's this movie called Help starring the Beatles, which I'd never heard of. And in getting into the Beatles, there were some records of my older brothers that were left behind when they went off to college and so forth. And quite a few Beatle records, but not all of them. And Help was not one of those albums. So that was a song that I probably had heard when I was a little kid, but I was 1 or 2 when it came out, so wasn't familiar with that. So I checked out the movie Help. It was on the 3 o'clock Dialing for Dollars movie on Channel 11. I remember that, and like I said, I'm about probably 8, 9, whatever I was. Just that made me, loved it, just fell in love with it. Made me go, my Beatle craziness just exponentially expanded. I was jumping around with a broom, pretending I was playing guitar and so forth. And this was still the so early on that I really didn't know them all yet. I was watching the show and watching the movie, saying, "Wait, is that Paul or is that George? Or I think that's George. I'm not sure." And learned all that quick enough. But used to be a lot more record stores around back in those days. A lot more bookstores too. And the shopping mall not far from my house had a couple of record stores, and then this was still back in the days when things like Sears and Stripling's and Murphy's and Penny's and those type stores had the record section with albums and singles. And I would go in there and I'd look through all the Beatles albums because I was begging my parents as I could to buy me more Beatles albums to fill out the collection there of the things that were not in the stuff that my brothers had left behind. And so I don't know, it was maybe, I don't know, a month or a week or 2 months, but shortly after I just went Beatle nuts, I go into Stripling's one day, and I head over there and look at the Beatles stuff, and there's these two new albums. It's them looking down from a parking garage balcony, which at that point I didn't know that that was the cover of their first album in England yet. So I didn't know what this was, but there's one where they're younger and there's one where they're older and have a whole lot more hair and beards and so forth. And at first I thought, I knew they were broken up, but maybe they got back together and put new albums out. I didn't know exactly what it was, and I looked at it, figured out they were greatest hits albums. And then, like I said, this was just shortly after me, even though I'd known about the Beatles all my life, but going, super Beatle fan. Shortly after all that happened, of course, being 9 years old, two double albums, I didn't have any money. It was getting close to one of my brother's birthdays, and I was home when my mom was talking to my dad about what to get him for his birthday, and light bulb went off over my head, and I said, hey, he likes the Beatles and all. He had Beatles albums. They just put out those two new greatest hits Beatles albums. That'd be a neat, my mom said, oh, that's a great idea. So she went and bought them and wrapped them up, and they were sitting around the house for a couple of weeks wrapped up. He didn't live there anymore, and I was very tempted to, but anyway, so she gave them to my brother on his birthday. He liked them, and I 2 seconds later said, hey, can I borrow those and give him a listen? And he was like, I guess, which I did, and that was 1973. Probably I should return those to him one of these days, but there's plenty of time. I'll get around to it. So at the time, I think and I played the dog out of those albums back then and still play them to this day, but I mean, it's over and over because there were quite a few songs on them. I didn't have the White Album at that point. I didn't have Help. I didn't have Yellow Submarine. I didn't have Let It Be yet. So quite a few albums songs and albums that I wasn't familiar with, even though some of the songs I'd heard on the radio, but just played those things. And I think I preferred the Blue Album at that time, but I played the Red Album a whole lot too, so I'm not sure. And even though I love the entire Beatles catalog from 1962 to when they broke up, my sweet spot, I think, is sort of that I Feel Fine, She's a Woman, up through White Album, Lady Madonna, the White Album, but then, the White Album, because you got to get Hey Jude and the White Album in there. So that's sort of 64 to 67, 8 period, which, of course, bridges the two albums. So my short answer to Red or Blue, which I've already gone into quite a bit of detail, is going to be that it is a tie on that, and I really just can't decide. Nowadays, I think maybe I like the early Beatles, but it changes. Sometimes it's the Revolver and the White Album period. Sometimes it's the Hard Day's Night stuff and the She Loves You stuff. And so I'm just going to have to say that it is a tie. So there we go. That's question number one. We only got 14 to go. Second question is US or UK as to the Beatle album collection, being that, of course, the UK albums are the ones where the Beatles, as they meant the albums as the Beatles meant them to be. In the US, they chopped the albums up and left songs off and added singles that weren't on the UK album so that they could squeeze 13 albums into 20 albums or however many albums they ended up putting out in the US. Top of my head, don't know how many that is right now. Can't remember anyway. But the UK albums are sort of seen as the canon now for the US and the UK. That was not the case until about 1987 or so, when the Beatles records came out on CD, because they didn't immediately come out on CD. CDs have been out for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years or so before the Beatles CDs were released, and they went with the British records instead of the American. But I got to go with American because that's what I grew up with. That's what I knew. And for years, I did know that they had the British albums there were less of them or they were a little different and so forth and so on. But I grew up with the American stuff. So that is what I'm going with. Plus, with Help, you get the James Bond theme before Help, which works a treat and is really great. And the British kids didn't get the James Bond theme. Someday I need to fly over to England and play this for people over there and shock them. They'll wonder what's going on there. Why is James Bond on a Beatles album? But American I go with. First two LPs, which is your favorite? Let me see here. So that would be, if you're talking British, Please Please Me or With the Beatles. Some days, this is my favorite Beatles album, but on other days, pretty much any Beatle album might be my favorite. It kind of changes, even though I have sort of a constant favorite, but I change around. I really love this album. This is one of my favorite. Their vocals are great throughout their career, of course, but just for pure vocal arrangements and richness and wonder, this is one of my favorite Beatles albums. But I'm going to go with this, and kind of shocks me that this album doesn't seem to get a whole lot of love from people. It's not hated, but it doesn't seem to be highly touted. But to me, much as I love this album, and it's great, there's a lot of covers. There's covers on this one too. But this still sort of sounds like the Beatles in development. It's still sort of 50-ish, early 60-ish. I give this album a 10, so don't think I'm putting it down or anything. But they're still sort of metamorphosing into the Beatles. And I think that they fully became the Beatles probably with She Loves You 45. But this is just sort of a sonic jump to me from that album to this album, just in songwriting and arranging and singing. And now they're not really a bunch of kids that love rock and roll and they're sort of doing early 60s and 50-ish rock and roll type stuff like they are on here. Now they're completely their own thing. And not that they aren't moments of that on the first album, there are, but here the whole thing. And it's got a great, it just explodes with It Won't Be Long. You've got a lot more songs on here that are written by the Beatles. You got George's first song. And nothing wrong with their covers. The Beatles did great covers. But yes, for me, it's going to be With the Beatles. Now, if you're talking America, that would be Meet the Beatles and or the Beatles' second album. Meet the Beatles is sort of With the Beatles, minus some songs and plus some songs and so forth. Beatles' second album is another Frankenstein put together album by Capitol Records and Dave Dexter. If you're talking American, love With the Beatles, but I'm going to go with this. Not only because my favorite Beatles album of all time, even though there are albums of theirs that are better than this, artistically, technically, so forth. It's also my favorite album of all time. So the Beatles' second album. Okay, that was number 3. Number 4, out of the last 2 albums, what would you pick? Fortunately, by now, things are the same in England and America. So your last 2 albums, you got Abbey Road and Let It Be. This is probably the better album. I mean, no probably about it. This is artistically and groundbreakingly and whateverly you want to come up with, the better album. But I'm going with this. Simply because, and I mean, the medley on Abbey Road is better than anything on this. But this is the one I go to a lot more often through the years and still to this day. There's something about this album I just love. Not that I don't have a lot of love for this too, but I've always, pretty much always, as far as I can remember, gone to this a lot more often than I have to Abbey Road. So I'm going to go Let It Be on that. Now, favorite disc on the White Album? That's the White Album for any of you that have never seen it. That, picture George, is, that's a tough one. Let's see. I'm going to go, and most people, by the way, where I found out about Calico Silver, like I said, was Matthew Street did a response video on the Beatles video questions, and several other people I saw have done one since, 2 or 3 others. Haven't seen anyone do response to the Rolling Stones question yet, and I wish they would because I'd like to hear their thoughts on it. But everyone, and I think I've seen 3 or 4 videos of people responding to Calico's Beatle video questions, has picked disc 1 so far. I think disc 2 for me, to be honest. Disc 1, you've got your essentials. You've got your just beautiful cream of the crop songs, Dear Prudence, Glass Onion, Obla Dee, which the other Beatles seem to hate other than Paul, but I always loved. While My Guitar Gently Weeps is, the essential, and Martha My Dear, so forth and so on. I guess Julia and I Will. But side 2 just seems to have more fun, just classic, just out and out, undeniable classics. So I guess Birthday, Everybody's Got Something to Hide is just a great rocker. But I mean, Sexy Sadie, Helter Skelter, Long, 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 which I wasn't crazy about when I was a kid, but have grown to love in the years since. Revolution 1 is just undeniably great. Savoy Truffle's pretty good. Cry Baby Cry, probably my favorite song on the album. I don't know. It's that I'd have to think about that some, but I think that's probably my favorite song on the album. Revolution number 9, which some people just scratch their heads. Some people think it's rubbish. Some people are intrigued by it. I'm not going to say it's essential song or it's even a song, but it is very thought-provoking, moved by the band, and so it does demand attention to some degree in that sense. But I'm going to go disc number 2. Not to say that disc number 1 isn't wonderful, beautiful, great also, but yeah, disc number 1. Disc number 2 gets my vote. Sorry, I'm looking at the questions here and making sure I'm in the right place. Most underrated album is question number 6. So I kind of had a bit of a tie here. My first thought was this, that really got torn apart quite a bit by critics in the day when it came out back then. And most people, when they're doing Beatle album rankings, this will fall down toward the bottom. Usually this or Beatles for Sale. Yellow Submarine will, just because it's, half of it's not Beatles. It's just film music. But this one usually falls pretty close down to the bottom. Now, I'm not going to say this is their best album. It's not, in my opinion anyway. They might say they did a lot better, because they certainly did. This isn't as groundbreaking, as envelope pushing, as experimental, as just profound as a lot of the earlier albums that came before it. This is pretty much just a straight ahead, kind of bluesy rock and roll album. Some ballads. It's my absolute favorite rainy day go-to album, always has been. And yes, there are a lot of other Beatle albums that are better than this, but I still think this is a great album, and I think that it's simply because of the fact that it's the Beatles that this gets a lot of stick sometime, because of the high standards they set on the albums before this from the very get-go back in 1962 leading up to this. I think if some other band, if the Band or the Byrds or the Flying Burrito Brothers or basically any other band would have put this out, it would have been hailed by Rolling Stone and Crawdaddy and whatever else rock press was around in those days. Is they didn't really have the term Americana then, but it would have been hailed as sort of a back to rootsy American whatever music. It would have been gotten a lot better reviews if it was anyone but the Beatles that had put this out, I believe. And even though it's not up to the standards they set on earlier albums, it's still greatness. And I still really love this album. So that one's underrated. But then I thought this one gets kind of lost in the shuffle. A lot of people talk about Beatles for Sale, and that is kind of I think it's a great album. It's also a great fall album, but it's also sort of a dreary, depressing, you can tell they're really worn out and tired album. But this one just sort of gets overlooked because the thought by a lot of people is that early on the Beatles were, the lovable mop tops and the Fab Four doing these boy meets girl happy upbeat songs, and then they sort of matured and got into more serious artistic endeavors, starting with, say, Revolver on, and Rubber Soul on into Revolver and Pepper, and forward from there. And this is sort of a bridge album between that. Now, I love the early Beatles just as much as I love the late Beatles. And it's kind of funny because sometimes I'll see people on here that say that they're not really interested in the Beatles until, say, Rubber Soul or Revolver period, and the earlier stuff they think is just sort of silly kids music or something, which I don't really get, because there was a lot of innovation on Hard Day's Night and on With the Beatles. Just even the picture on the album cover with the Beatles and different instrumentation and so forth. But anyway, this is sort of in between all that, if you want to look at it that way, is sort of their mop top phase and their more serious artistic phase. So you still got, kind of Beatlemania type songs, which I love. They're great. The Night Before, I Need You, great George song. Another Girl, You're Gonna Lose That Girl. But you got Help, which is, again, not only my favorite Beatles song. Help is my favorite song ever, and it's a bouncy rock and roll, upbeat music, and you can look at it as just a boy meets girl, boy needs girl to help him get himself together or whatever. You can look at it as a scream or a cry for help. That's something quite a bit darker than that, musically upbeat, lyrically downbeat. You can look at it as a lot of things. You can get a lot of things out of that song. So it's a more mature jump in their songwriting. Of course, Ticket to Ride, same thing. And at this point, they're competing not so much with Chad and Jeremy and Herman's Hermits and all. Now they're competing with the Yardbirds and John Mayall and The Who and things like that. And it's to their credit that they met that challenge, and their music took a step forward with Ticket to Ride. Just a beautiful song. You've got to Hide Your Love Away, obviously the Dylan-esque influence there, but that's a song that you can read on a lot of different levels, just more mature. You got Yesterday, of course, the standard, and on the British one you've got I've Just Seen a Face and It's Only Love, which we got on Rubber Soul over here, which they always seem to fit better on the Rubber Soul album. But just a more mature songwriting and artistic and instrumentation and all of that. So this seems like a big step forward, which not to say that Hard Day's Night and even the Beatles for Sale weren't. There was, Beatles for Sale, you've got I'm a Loser, which isn't typically what pop stars were singing about back in 1964 and 5 era. But anyway, I think this is a lot better album than it gets credit for, and it seems to get sort of lost in the shuffle sometime, other than, of course, the hits Ticket to Ride, Help, and Yesterday get a lot of attention. But the album overall just seems to be a little forgotten, and I think that's a shame, because I think it's a great album. Where were we? Okay, most underrated album. Favorite opener, pretty much every Beatle album has a great opener. I don't know, the Yellow Submarine album opens with Yellow Submarine, so okay, but it won't be long. I already mentioned on with the Beatles, I saw her standing there on their first album, Help, my favorite song of all time on Help. I think I'm going to have to go, though, with Taxman because, A, it's my favorite George song, Beatle or solo. It's just so cool. I mean, the guitar, the singing, that opening, that 1, 2, 3, somebody coughing is just so weird and cool, and I can't imagine how just what the hell that must have felt like in 1966 if you went out and bought that album brand new and put it on and heard that for the first time. But it's just a cool rockin', just a great, just I mean, love Taxman. It's so favorite opener. I'll go with that. Even though it was hard because there are great openers on all of them. You know, Magical Mystery Tour, Sergeant Pepper, right on down the line. Favorite cover song. I'm not a big fan of cover songs, but the Beatles did them really well. So did the Rolling Stones. I mentioned that because I think, I'd have to look at that list, but I think there's a question about Rolling Stones cover songs in the Stones list. I could be wrong about that, but Beatles did cover songs really well, whereas most others didn't. The Who did some early on. Some of them were okay. Some of them were sort of so-so. None of them were really great. The Kinks, my second favorite band after the Beatles, did some cover songs early on. Again, some okay. Quite a few of them were sort of, yeah, just sort of there. The Beatles really knew how to take a cover song and make it their own, add something new to it, add something interesting to it, so it wasn't just a rote recreation of what the original artist that did the song sounded like. And that's my problem with cover songs, is a lot of times there's bad, but a lot of times it's like, okay, you did a cover of, I don't know, an Elvis or a Otis Redding song, and it kind of just sounds like the song that Elvis did. And so if I want to listen to it, I'll listen to Elvis's version, because your version isn't any better and it really doesn't add anything to it. The Beatles knew how to add something, make it exciting, make it their own. And a lot of cases, their cover versions were as good or better in a lot of cases than the original. Now, by the time of Beatles for Sale, their cover versions got a little tired, because I think they just were so tired and worn out from touring and radio and TV and making records and traveling all over the world, that they just didn't have it in them to write, because they had written all their own songs for Hard Day's Night. The album before that, with Beatles for Sale, they went back to cover versions, and I think they were just too worn out to write a full set of songs for a full album, and so they probably just said, well, we need some more songs, let's just do some of these covers of some of the old rock and roll songs we did back in our Cavern and Hamburg days. And those are okay. Rock and roll music's really good, but some of the other ones are just okay, and their heart doesn't really seem into it. They don't seem excited about it the way they did on Meet the Beatles, the Beatles' second album, and Please Please Me and all. But anyway, those early cover songs they did, they're just great. So my favorite is Please Mr. Postman, closely followed by You Really Got a Hold on Me. But Please Mr. Postman, it's just, I love it. And I love, is it the, who does that originally? Not the Shrew, the Marvelettes, I think. They do a great version too, but the Beatles version, John's vocals and all, it's actually one of my favorite. If I was doing my top 10 or 15 Beatles songs, that would be in there, even though it's not a song that they wrote, but I just love that song. Favorite song no one talks about, You're Gonna Lose That Girl. I love that song. I remember the scene in Help. Like I said, when I saw that, they played it on TV within a week or a month or whatever, when I became a super duper duper Beatles fan. And I love that scene. I love that song. I love the harmonies. It's just, love the, I guess, bongo drums or whatever in it. The guitar solo in the middle of it. It sounds very Beatlesque, but it also sounds like something that could be on the Beach Boys Today album. I didn't know that when I was 9 years old, but, because I mean, I knew of the Beach Boys, but I didn't know a whole lot about them back then. But yeah, it could have been a single. I think that could have been a number one hit for the band, and it's just kind of stuck on Help, and it shows up on the Beatles channel radio station on XM sometimes, but it's not something that got a lot of radio play or attention outside of the Help movie of the album. So you're going to lose that girl. And the other thing that came to mind, sorry to be giving two answers to these, but some of these kind of, there's a like a tie and I can't really decide. Martha My Dear off the White Album. It's never been considered one of the epic songs or important songs off the album by most people, I don't think. I always loved it. I mean, A, it's about Paul's dog, so how can you go wrong there? B, I love that piano. I think Paul's playing the piano on that, as far as I know. I don't think it's George Martin, but love the piano intro. I have, when I'm playing the White Album in my car on CD, I've been known to sit there and let the piano intro play through and then hit return so that it jumps back and you get to hear it again and play it through several times. But the horns and just the way the different stages of the song where the musical motif changes throughout it and shifts around. And Martha My Dear, I think that's a great song. There was no single from the White Album. Years later in '76, there was Helter Skelter, and Julia was released to cash in on the Charles Manson movie by Capitol Records. But at the time in '68, there was no single from the White Album. And that might have been a good one. I don't know. I mean, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, there's some others that would have been good candidates for singles probably. But Martha My Dear and You're Gonna Lose That Girl. Favorite George song? We've already answered this one. It's Taxman. And we're talking George and the Beatles here, not George solo. George solo, my favorite song is Give Me Love, Give Me Peace on Earth. But Taxman followed, excuse me, followed closely by It's All Too Much. I just adore those two songs. So, and George had good songs in the Beatles. So, I mean, they're all good, pretty much. One or two, they're maybe just so-so, but most of them are pretty top stuff. Also, just Don't Bother Me gets a complimentary, what do you call it? Complimentary mention. I really love that one too, and a lot of others. But Taxman would be my favorite George song in the Beatles. Um, if you could only own one, and that is a two-part question. Between Pepper and Satanic Majesties, and even Jeff Calico Silver, who likes the Beatles a lot, but he's more of a Stones fan than a Beatles fan. Even he's said, okay. And that would be my choice too, Pepper over this. This is a good album. I like it. Everyone should have both of these. But this, in my opinion, isn't even the Rolling Stones' best album in 1967. I do like it. And if I was to do my top 10, top 15 albums in 1967, I'm not sure this would even make the list. Not because it's a bad album, it's a good album, but that was just such a rich musical year and just so much wonderful music came out that year that there are, I think, 15 albums better than this. It's good. But it's Pepper. Okay, the other part of that being a two-part question, was if you had to choose between this or this wonder. This one's a little harder, but there's people out there that think this thing is overrated or boring or no good. To each their own. I don't get it. This is brilliance. This is just what, teenage symphony to God stuff, and as they say. But it's going to be Pepper, but not by the wide margin that it was over the Rolling Stones. It's close on these two, because these are both, scale of 1 to 10. These are both 20s. But it's this one, just by a little bit. So yeah, Pepper over Pet Sounds. So okay, I didn't get those, so I'm not going to show the album. I'm going to jump ahead a question. Question 14 was, what is your favorite album from 1970? out of the, not counting Let It Be, out of the Beatles solo album. So you got McCartney, you got the two Ringos, Buku's a Blues and Sentimental Journey, John Lennon Plastic Ono Band, and George Harrison's All Things Must Pass. Those are all good albums. Ringo albums are even good, I think, on those two. Not as good as the other three, but good. I do love all of them. I would probably go All Things Must Pass, number one, followed by Plastic Ono Band, followed by McCartney, but All Things Must Pass. The question 13 then is, if someone was, I think he said, I don't know if he just said if someone wanted to read a Beatles book, so maybe they already know some stuff about them. I took it to mean if someone was getting into the Beatles and wanted a good book to read to learn more about them. Maybe I'm wrong on that. But anyway, if you were to recommend a Beatles book to somebody, what would it be? My first thought was Tune In by Mark Lewison, which this is the super deluxe edition with 2 books. It's got like 1,000 extra pages from the regular edition. Here is the regular edition. And this came out, about 10 years ago. And it's very exhaustive. Probably the best Beatle biography to date, arguably. This is the regular edition, which is, that's all indexed, but it's not numbered on the pages. So this is like 800 pages roughly, and this only takes you to 1962, just right after like the release of Love Me Do and Please Please Me 45s. So you can tell that's pretty exhaustive, and these are like 1,600 pages, the same book. It's just extra material in the extended edition. So that's probably among the best of the Beatles books. But then I thought, if somebody's, and that's great if you're a Beatles fan, a big Beatles fan, you want all the information and so forth you can get. And I can't wait for, there's supposed to be 2 more volumes of those to come. I hope. It's been 10, 11 years and we haven't gotten volume 2 yet. So I don't know when or if that's going to happen, or if we're ever going to get volume 3 for that matter, but we can hope. But if you're just getting into the Beatles, or if you're a casual Beatles fan and you pick that book up, it might be like you're slightly parched and I turn a fire hose full blast and point it towards your mouth. It may be a little bit too much overkill of information and details than just someone that's just getting into the band or just a casual fan would want. You know, big time Beatle fans, they want all those tidbits, and I love those books. So maybe the Hunter Davies book from the 60s would be a good one. But I thought of 2 others. This would be, and this is my original copy, I think this came out in 1978, I believe. 77, but I think it was 78. And Nicholas Schaffner, never knew how to pronounce his name. Sadly, he's passed away now. He wrote another Beatles book for kids in his time. He wrote a book about Pink Floyd. He wrote a great book that I should have pulled out, that's The British Invasion A to Z, which has big chapters on, well, larger chapters on Beatles, Bowie, Rolling Stones, Kinks, and Who, and Pink Floyd, and then A to Z of all the other bands, ranging from the Animals up to like the Clash and the Sex Pistols and so forth. But this was his first book, and this was sort of the gold standard Beatle book. It came out when I was in 8th grade, and I remember my mom bought this for me. So the 78 this came out, I think, because I got this shortly before I went to my first Beatle Fest in Chicago in 1978, which I went to the summer after 8th grade. But yeah, I just devoured this book and read it cover to cover, I don't know how many times through the years. And it's a pretty good, I mean, there's some new information and updating that has come to light in the 43 years since this came out, of course. But this is is a very easy, very readable. I'd like to get a girl who's easy right about now. And then, anyway, this is very readable, very It's it's comprehensive, but it doesn't get bogged down in the details and the weeds that someone that's just a casual fan may not be all that interested in. So it's a fun read, but it's also very informative. Great pictures, great information, and it's just a great book. So that was one. The other one I thought of was another Beatles book from back in the '70s. This one came out in 1976. I remember buying this at Walden Books in Seminary South. So I was 12, I think. You don't hear a whole lot about this one, but I always liked this one too. And it came out a couple of years before the Beatles Forever, like I said. There's my original copy in mint shape. And another, that was actually the first time, I think this is one that has a picture of the butcher cover in it. And that's the first time I'd heard of the butcher cover, but that's the first time I'd actually seen a picture of the cover. I have one now, but I didn't have one then. And, oh yeah, there we go. So I did have that by that time, but I'd never seen that, so that was exciting. Wasn't in color or anything. Anyway, this is a fun book. So the kid that wrote this, he's an old man now, but Ron Schomburg, kind of a dorky, comes off as kind of a dorky kid, but he was, I don't know, like in 6th or 7th grade when the Beatles came out with "I Want to Hold Your Hand" in January '64, and so he grew up with the Beatles, and it's just sort of story of his life, going to school, going to high school, going to college, first date, some stuff like that. Some of that's interesting, some of it's kind of dippy, kind of comes off as a dick sometimes, because there's some of the stuff that he says in there, like, well, Kennedy got shot and killed, but that didn't mean anything to me except that my cartoons were canceled for the whole week of TV, or I heard about civil rights stuff, but living in the middle of Kansas, I didn't know people like that, so it didn't affect me. So he kind of comes off as a little bit of an idiot sometimes. But, I mean, probably true to what his experience was, so whatever. But it's a pretty good story, and it's pretty straightforward telling of the Beatles story. And it is kind of neat to get a perspective of how that affected him being there in real time as the Beatles were happening and the new records came out, and the excitement that stirred in him and his friends and so forth. So it's a fun book to read. And this was $5.95 back in 1976. I wish books were still in that price range. So yeah, the last question is sort of a out of left field thing. What's your favorite Badfinger album? And I think he said on Apple. So they did albums like Wish You Were Here later on other labels, but the Apple records. I'm going to go with Straight Up. I don't have any Badfinger albums. I love Badfinger. I've got some 45s that I've had forever, but I've got the 45 of Day After Day, which I've had since I was like 5th, 6th grade. And I played that thing so much that if I was to put it on the record player now, I don't know if it'd even play, if the grooves might have been just worn off from overplaying. That's probably my favorite Badfinger song, no matter what or that. But that one's on Straight Up, so I'll go with that. So there are 15 Beatle questions in 44 minutes. And I will be back with a video on the Rolling Stones questions from Calico Silver. Go to his channel, check him out. He's got a lot of good stuff over there. I think you'll like it.